Okay, about ready to get started. Everybody have your seats and wrap up the conversations for a few minutes, and we'll turn our conversation over to solar. So good morning, everybody. My name is Beth Galante. I'm a New Orleanian for 30 plus years now, and I work at a solar startup here in the city that does residential solar. It's actually the only company in the U.S. that does financing for low-income homeowners. And we've got more than 12,000 customers in mainly Louisiana, but also in New York and Connecticut, and we're just getting started in New Jersey. So today's panel, we have an amazing group of folks that are just fighting the good fight on the ground and have definitely gone through a lot of battles and will continue to battle as traditional utilities and energy sources continue to fight to keep solar either out of a market or to handicap it in a market. So overall, just going to kind of give you a high-level perspective of what the main regulatory and legal regimes are. And we really don't want to spend a lot of time just talking at you this morning. I know it's early. I hope everybody's caffeinated, because we're very hopeful that we can open this to a general discussion to make sure that it is as helpful to you as possible and to try and get all your primary questions answered. So we're going to start. Our first speaker today is going to be Steve Levitas. I got it. Thank you. He is Senior Vice President for Regulatory Affairs and Strategy at Cypress Creek Renewables, which is the second largest utility-scale solar developer in the country. He's working in 20 states plus and dealing with the ongoing challenges at FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Before that, he's with FLS Energy, doing utility-scale solar as well, which was folded into the Cypress Creek family, and before that, senior counsel with the law firm of Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton, where he was a partner for more than 15 years before coming on to Cypress Creek. And when Steve and I were catching up right before we started, I also wanted to flag that he worked on a big project in New Orleans post-Katrina to help to focus state, local, and national attention on rebuilding sustainably. The Make It Right project in the lower 9th Ward. Helped advise on that, and I actually worked on it as well, so we didn't realize we had an overlap there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk to you about regulatory regime.
Good morning, everybody. I thought to be sure that everybody's awake and paying attention, we start with a little audience participation. So, let me ask you to raise your hand if you like Monopoly. Oh, the game. So what is your favorite color? Do you like the thimble, the dog? The battleship. Well, I actually wasn't talking about the game. What I'm talking about is the exclusive ownership or control of the supply of goods or services in a defined market. Monopoly. So let me ask my question again. Raise your hand if you like Monopoly. That's about what I expected. So, why is it that we don't like Monopoly? Choice, exactly.
Or cost.
Cost. Competition generates innovation. Innovation.
It's bad for consumers.
Bad for consumers.
Or regulation.
Yes, exactly. How about the massing of political control and influence?
Big money.
So, given all these reasons that we don't like monopoly, surely in this free market, competitive, best economic system in the world of the United States of America, we must not have any monopolies, right? Well, if your answer is yes, you would be wrong, because we do have, and the reason we're here today is to talk about, one very dominant monopolistic system in our economy and our society, and that's the control of electric generation by monopoly providers. So we have this system as a vestige of 100-year-old, more than 100-year-old evolution of our electric system. At a time when, if you know much about the history, early days of electric generation, you had this kind of mad dash of competing technologies and suppliers, and wires were going up everywhere, plants being built, and that clearly didn't make sense. And in fact, even today, electric distribution and generation transmission systems are what's referred to as a natural monopoly, in the sense that it doesn't make sense to have wires from multiple providers running all over the countryside. You really need a single provider. These investments cost billions of dollars, and the developers of those facilities need to understand that they're going to get a return. And so, in those limited instances, I think most people think that some form of monopoly-like control continues to make sense, although we've seen a lot of evolution into structured wholesale markets that even with transmission distribution have changed the game dramatically. But when it comes to electric generation, the building of power plants to supply our electric power needs, I don't think there's any economist in the country or the world who would tell you that the right business model is monopoly control of large generation facilities. In fact, I said large, so in the 1920s, maybe it made sense, and for some years beyond, to build these giant baseload power plants, centrally located, required huge capital investments, and so maybe we're only going to get built if the developer had the assurance that they were going to be able to get a rate of return by controlling the market. But today, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies like mine that are ready, willing, and able to finance and construct electric generation systems and do so at a lower cost than investor-owned monopoly electric utilities. And so we have this very dynamic marketplace where we are trying to figure out how to get into the market and sell our power in order to provide all the benefits that you very quickly identified from competition. So in the case of electric generation monopoly control specifically, you talked about some of the generic ills or evils of monopoly, but they play out in the context of electric generation as well. So what do we see? We see that monopolists decide what it is they want to build. Build, not what consumers want, but what they think they can earn the best rate of return on. Because the way they get paid is they make capital investments, they go to regulatory commissions at the state level, many of whom are heavily controlled or influenced politically by these all-powerful political players. And by the way, in almost every state of the country, the largest donor of political contributions is the investment of electric utilities. So they go to these captive commissions, often some do better jobs than others, some are blatantly captive and controlled by the utilities. But in any case, they have to compete or try to keep up with, I should say, with the utilities with respect to incredibly complicated technical and economic subject matter that relates to rates and the need for power plants and the like. And the best of them simply, even with pretty good staff, have a hard time doing their job. So that's the first thing in terms of what gets built. You have tremendous control on the part of these regulated parties. And there's no better example of that than the fact that we continue to have our electric generation fleet in this country dominated by natural gas, now to a lesser extent coal, and nuclear, comprising in total something like 90% of the electric generation supply in the country, with the remaining small fraction, 5 to 10%, depending on the state, being in renewables, even though we have overwhelming demand and desire for renewable energy in this country from both residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional customers. In fact, I'm sure you know that something like 2/3 of the Fortune 100, half of the Fortune 500 companies have made sustainability, clean energy, low carbon, no carbon commitments and pledges. So you have a company like Walmart saying, we are going to be 50% carbon free by 2025 and 100% companies do not have the ability to go to a company like mine and engage in a bilateral transaction and say, I'd like to buy power from you instead of from this investor-owned utility that's powered a third by natural gas, a third by coal, a third by nuclear, because the regulatory regime does not allow that customer choice, that free transaction to occur. So that's the context that we're facing as we talk about the future of solar development, and you could extend this to renewables more broadly. So we want to talk a little bit about what the antidotes are to this problem, and it's a serious problem in my judgment, of continued monopoly control of electric. Well, Victor's going to talk a little bit more about one type of solution that has had some currency across the country, and that takes two related forms. One is deregulation of retail markets. So all of you are electricity customers. Maybe nobody in this room has the ability to choose who they buy their electricity from, but 13 states in the country, in a kind of wave of deregulation in the 90s, passed retail choice, customer choice deregulation statutes that opened up the generation market so you could have a free transaction with the electric supply. But that still leaves 37 states where that doesn't occur. In addition, at the wholesale level, this doesn't help you as a retail customer, but it helps me as a wholesale supplier. There's roughly half the country that is in what's called structured wholesale markets. So at least I, as a generator, can go to a market of wholesale customers and have a mechanism, a market mechanism for selling my power, as opposed to having the only offtake, the only buyer of my power be an investor-owned utility, which has all the control of that transaction, all the leverage, all the ability to negotiate. So you don't do it, we think about monopoly control of sellers, and monopoly control, actually the technical word is monopsony, where you have a single buyer. Just imagine if you're trying to sell whatever it is you sell and you've only got one customer, they're going to hold all the cards in those negotiations. So opening up wholesale markets is helpful, but we're still here in the Southeast, which you get nicer down in Louisiana, but much of the Southeast, much of the Pacific Northwest, they're not well-developed wholesale markets. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as another regulatory structure, but I want to, in a little bit of additional time I want to talk to you about another important antidote to this evil to monopoly control of electric generation. So let me ask another question. How many folks in the room have heard of PURPA? Does that acronym mean anything to anybody? Good, got a few hands up. So that is the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act of 1978. And this law, arguably one of the most important federal laws ever passed dealing with renewable energy, was enacted in 1978 in response to the Arab oil crisis and embargo. Jimmy Carter was president. The opponents of PURPA use that as a really pejorative way to talk about PURPA. Carter-era law, the kiss of death. But it's 40 years old, and it enacted a few simple concepts. And the most important central concept of PURPA is that these electric utilities that I'm talking about are required by federal law to buy the output, the energy and capacity, from what's called qualifying facilities, or QFs. And those consist of cogeneration facilities, so it could be a biomass or natural gas-fired coal-fired plant that's co-located with an industrial host that's taking the steam. So many of you may know that standalone electric power plants are hugely inefficient because they generate all this heat that goes nowhere. But if you can capture that heat in the form of steam, excuse me, use it in a manufacturing facility, you greatly increase their efficiency. So promoting cogeneration was part of the goal, also promoting renewables, solar, wind, biomass, and other renewables. And so if these are the definition of a qualifying facility, the investor-owned utility, the electric utilities, not just investor-owned, including co-ops and municipalities as well, are required to buy the output of these facilities. required to buy the output at what's called avoided cost. Now, avoided cost, simplest level, it means the marginal cost that the utility would incur in generating or buying power on its own. So when its own power plants going to the market buying power from somewhere else. And so the premise is that Congress believed that qualifying facilities needed to be encouraged to the point where they could beat what the utilities could do. I'm sorry, meet what the utilities could do. Not to beat it, you have to beat it. That it would be better to require the utilities to take the power from this source rather than keep doing what they've been doing. And so we're serving the twin purpose of diversifying the universe of suppliers. So other companies besides these big monopolies, so we now start to get some other players in the market who can become political forces and participate and affect policy, but equally important, diversifying supply away from conventional resources. There are a couple of the details here, but so the avoided costs, I got another slide about this. One thing, let me say something about PURPA. It's an interesting law. PURPA is what's called cooperative federalism. And what that means is the broad contours of PURPA are laid out in federal law, in rules of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and in many orders of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But a lot of the details are expressly left to the states to figure out. And that has created this hodgepodge of competing state concepts that we'll talk about that some, as well as a tremendous amount of litigation over whether what any individual state is doing complies with PURPA. I won't say much about this, but a really key issue that we get into in PURPA implementation litigation is when the qualifying facility is able to lock in its power purchase or power sale price. Because these prices, the avoided costs fluctuate over the last decade for sure. They've gone down dramatically as natural gas prices have gone down. And so when you're able to lock in that price is really important. And there's huge battles around that. And this concept of a legally enforceable obligation is one of the really powerful tools of PURPA because it says that we as a qualifying facility can set that point where the price is fixed by unequivocally committing ourselves to sell our output to the utility. So the utility can be jerking us around as they often do. They can be refusing to give us a contract, sign a contract, impose unreasonable terms, and FERC has recognized that we control that formation and can lock them in and require them to buy at a certain price. There's an enormous amount of litigation around that issue. Avoided costs, simple concept, marginal costs, I mentioned, but good luck trying to figure out what that number is. I've been around for a long time. I've been involved in a lot of complex environmental and energy matters. There is nothing that I have ever done in my career that is as remotely complicated, mind-boggling, brain damaging as the avoided cost determination process. This is done through a long contested proceeding, battles of experts. You can see multiple different methodologies, many different factors that have to get considered. Every one of those factors, I can guarantee the utility tries to manipulate in its direction to get the lowest value that it can possibly defend, and we get back to the utilities' positions being friendly to the utilities and allowing them to do what they want. So huge battles about what avoided costs are. Probably the single biggest issue for qualifying facilities in the market today is the length of the contract that we're entitled to receive in order to sell our power. Because we're in the project finance business, that means we have to go out and persuade investors and lenders excuse me, to provide the funds for us to build our facilities. And like any investors and lenders, they're going to get these financial pro formas that look at the revenue coming in, the costs going out, deciding what kind of rate of return they're going to get. And obviously, how long the contract is for affects that enormously. Obviously, price is the other variable. But this is an issue that has been the source of tremendous battles and litigation in the states about One is the necessary length of contract term, and you see a site here to the Wyndham Solar case, December of 2016. Court issued a very helpful decision in which they said, they never said that contracts have to be a certain length. But the Wyndham case, they said explicitly, these PURPA PPAs have got to be of a sufficient duration to allow the QF a reasonable opportunity to attract capital. So now we've got something really, another thing to litigate about, what that is. That litigation is ongoing in several forums. There's an issue that gets a lot of play, I think, overblown about when do two facilities actually should be considered one facility for the purpose of the 80 megawatt cap under PURPA. Interconnection is a big issue that I'm going to skip over in the interest of time. And one other thing, I think Victor may talk about this a little bit, is in 2005 there was an amendment to PURPA, and I mentioned these evolving wholesale markets around the country. Well, the utilities came into FERC, Congress actually, in 2005, amended FERC, and said, PURPA's kind of outlived its usefulness because we have all these wholesale markets, and so these QFs can now sell their power into the wholesale markets. They don't need this must-purchase obligation from the utilities any longer, at least with respect to the wholesale markets. And so FERC adopted a bright line test where it said, basically, they accepted that argument that if a QF is larger than 20 megawatts in size and is operating in one of these structured wholesale markets, FERC said, we're going to presume that they can sell their power without the leg up that FERC provides by making the utility buy their power. So we will relieve the utility of that must-purchase obligation. Below 20 megawatts, they said the opposite. We're going to assume that a smaller facility doesn't have that non-discriminatory access, and so the utilities remain obligated to purchase their power. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of the context in which we operate. PURPA as I call it an antidote to the evils of monopoly control of electric generation. We're going to talk about a couple of other related issues in the intro. We're going to get into some questions about both how these programs are being implemented, some of the threats to them, some of the changes in Congress that occurred, and where we see things going.
Thank you, Steve. So that's great, a really wonderful high-level introduction to the various regulatory and clearly the most critical legal framework. Steve certainly has been on the front line of these battles for a long time. And I just wanted to flag every state, every utility, every region is so different. There is never anything cookie cutter about any of these battles, which I guess is law anyway, but it is stunning how you get the same arguments over and over again, but they are always very location intensive, and it just takes a tremendous amount of resources and legal talent to keep pushing back against monopolies who really at the end of the day it's their full-time gig to fight to keep that monopoly access and control. So we're going to turn next to our second speaker, Victor Flatt, who is the Dwight Olds Chair in Law and Faculty Director of Environment, Energy, and the Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston Law Center. Sorry, that's a mouthful. Prior to that, he was the inaugural Taft Distinguished Professor. He held the Taft Distinguished Professorship, in environmental law at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he was director of the Climate, Energy, Environment, and Economics Center. And he was also the inaugural O'Quinn Chair in environmental law at the Houston Law Center. He's taught all over the place, and I encourage you to check out his bio. Does some amazing legal writing on these issues of PURPA and state issues, and he's going to focus in a little bit more on PURPA as well as states' roles in implementing PURPA with some examples. So with no further ado.
Thank you so much, Beth, and I'm glad to see you all here. And Steve, thanks for the great setup for all of this. As has been alluded to, even though there's this federal regulatory system, even though we have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, when it comes to solar and other renewables and electricity in general, the real game, the real issue is at the states. And how states do this and regulate things has an enormous impact on how much of solar will penetrate or wind or other such things. You have the deregulated states, and I'll come back to that in a moment. You have states that are in these wholesale markets, which give some sort of market signals, and then you have what are called vertically integrated states, where you essentially have one or more dominant, what I would call legacy power companies, such as in North Carolina, Duke Energy. Okay, so to talk about the deregulatory states, I'm actually going to start and say something I never, ever get to say. Texas is a leader. It's super exciting. In 2000, well, let me back up for a second. Texas, electricity in this country moves through power lines, as we know, and there are essentially three grids through which it moves. There's the Eastern Interconnect, which is like it sounds in the East. Louisiana's on that. There's the Western Interconnect, and then there's Texas. Texas has its own electricity grid. There are slight interconnections around the edges, but essentially all of the electricity produced in Texas more or less stays in Texas. That means that Texas is not under the direct control of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It's the only state in the country where it isn't. So when Texas deregulated power producers, right, who could sell into the market, they didn't have to worry about FERC or anything else. They just, or PURPA even. But they created what now almost looks like maybe a good model. Well, what's so special about Texas and this model? Well, first of all, Texas has more renewable penetration than any state in the country by far. Wind penetration now is at 22,000, 23,000 megawatts. It has peaked actually at 40-some thousand megawatts, which is over half the power load in the state. How could one grid integrate so much of a renewable? Solar, on the other hand, has been slow, and I'll come back to why that is. And yet, we've learned some valuable lessons from a fully deregulated state. What are those lessons? Well, basically, when you deregulate who produces the power, you take the risk off the consumer as to whether or not they're going to get locked into higher or lower prices, and that risk now goes to the companies. They've got to decide when power is going to be needed. They've got to decide how much they need to produce, at what cost. They have to take that risk. If they overbuild, it's their loss to their shareholders, not to the ratepayers of a state. Compare that to a vertically integrated state, such as North Carolina. In a vertically integrated state, the dominant power company will go to the Public Utility Commission and say, we need to charge so much per kilowatt hour so that we can get our rate of return. And to do that, maybe we want to build more nuclear or coal or gas, or we want to pull this offline. We might want to integrate wind or solar, maybe, but you need to pay us X amount. And so these large-scale electricity generating facilities, particularly the utility scale, they have lifetimes of 20 to 50 years. So you've got a company telling the state to lock in rates that they are never going to get out of. And we've seen such debacles around the country. The nuclear debacle in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s, the current nuclear debacle, the debacle on the coal carbon capture project in Mississippi, where investors, the companies, are trying to saddle their customers with these enormous cost overruns. So in a deregulated state, you don't have that. They have to take that risk. What that also means is consumers get choice. It is stunning, I think, for anyone here, if you even just drive into a city in Texas, you'll see 30, 40, 50 billboards offering to change your electricity service. You can buy your power at night. You can buy it in the day. You can buy all solar. You can buy all wind. You can buy half wind, half solar. You can buy half renewable. You can vary your rates. You can do whatever you want. There are 500 different rate plans. I can go into my computer and with a touch of a button, I can change my provider and change my electricity contract easier than I can change my cell phone. Now, that has led to relatively lower prices, but it has also led to this incredible growth in renewables. And while it's been for wind so far, we think the next move is going to be in solar, and we'll talk about that later. The other deregulated states like California, et cetera, are deregulated, but they have to be controlled by FERC. They don't have as much control over things like transmission capacity, et cetera, when they cross state boundaries. That can limit the ability to put renewables onto the grid. And then vertically integrated states everything has to go through the PUC. In between, we have the structured wholesale markets. So Louisiana's in MISO, there's PJM, there's New England, California integrated system operator. In these systems, all the states have gotten together into a region, and they take the lowest cost power and dispatch that throughout the interconnected region. And people bid into that market. So solar can bid into that market. Solar can bid into the Texas market. Wind can do those things. And what that's led to, as we've seen, is, again, further penetration of renewables in these markets. In MISO, it's been wind. In PJM in New England, it's been wind and a little bit more solar. And that is what has been threatening coal plants. That is what has been threatening nuclear plants. They cannot provide the marginal cost of electricity at the same level as a competitive market. The competitive market favors natural gas, wind, solar. Remember, when wind and solar are finally built, the cost of fuel is zero, right? So the marginal cost drops to zero. So dispatching power from that becomes a really good thing to do. So again, in our most deregulated market, Texas, we see in 1 year alone, 4,000 megawatts of coal power have come offline because they can't compete in the market with wind and natural gas and solar coming. Okay, when we talk about solar, though, we're also talking about two different kinds of solar, and Steve alluded to this. We're talking about what we call utility scale solar, which is like a farm, and you may have seen these, of solar panels. Or we're talking about rooftop solar or distributed generation, solar that can be installed on your house. In both of these cases, outside of Texas, these facilities, if they're 20 megawatts or less, are subject to the FERC PURPA interpretation, right? The dominant energy company has to take those facilities. They have to let them pull their power in, and they do so at this avoided cost rate. You can still change a lot of things at the state level to make that more likely or less likely. North Carolina is now a leader in utility scale solar, thanks to people like Steve and Thad, but part of the reason is the Public Utility Commission there came up with a standardized contract for 20 megawatts or less utility scale solar, saying if you're at this level, Duke Energy has to buy your power at X cost for a kilowatt hour, and their terms of 20 years. Well, that led to a gold rush, companies going in to try to get the solar online. And it had massive penetration. On the other hand, rooftop is higher in states like California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, which may seem odd, and I'll explain why in a moment. And that requires, again, these rooftops to interconnect into the system and the power company to buy it. But if they don't have standardized contracts, it's a little harder to get that moving. Well, what do rooftop solar things have? What makes them viable? Because at the cost of installation and the interconnection, it will be, on average, slightly higher for rooftop than utility scale. So where does rooftop fit into all of this? Well, two things. One, many states have interpreted PURPA to create something called net metering. That's a term you've heard before, and you're probably going to hear it again. What does net metering mean? Well, that means that you pay, when you're pulling power off the grid, you pay the retail rate, but if you're putting power back onto the grid, it's offset from what you buy. essentially that gives you a retail price for your power going on to the grid. Now, a retail price for your power going onto the grid is a lot higher, most of the time, than the avoided cost of a qualified facility under PURPA. Well, where did this come from? PURPA goes all the way back to 1978. Electricity meters, again, if you have one, you still may have these, used to be mechanical, right? They turn. Well, if you're putting power on the grid or off the grid, they just kind of turn one way or they turn the other, and you can't really tell where the power is coming, which way it's going. You just get the net at the end of the month. So net metering used to be really the only way to actually measure how much power a person pulled off the grid or pushed into the grid. And so you had to do something like net metering. Well, now we have smart meters. We have smart meters in a lot of states, a lot of penetration in Texas and California. They're coming to other places that can tell you instantaneously when power is going in and when power is coming out. Because of that, the legacy companies are attempting to shut down net metering wherever they can, right? Because net metering is more costly to them, right? They would rather sell you your power at retail and then buy it back at avoided cost. And that is partly explained by the smart metering, and it's partly explained by the increasing penetration of solar rooftop, right? It didn't matter in 1978 when it was less than 1,000%. When it's up to 2% of the country, expected to grow to 5%, when wind is now at 7% and expected to grow, it all of a sudden matters to these companies. They're looking at where are they going to be if everybody starts generating this power. And so we've seen battles, Louisiana, Nevada, Arizona, California, Massachusetts, as to whether or not to allow this net metering, and if we do allow net metering, in what circumstances. Now, in the CLE materials that we produced, I worked on a paper that looked at variations of states' implementation of PURPA, and the thing that we learned from that paper is that net metering is the most important factor in pushing development of solar and distributed generation. The most important factor. Second most important factor is what the average cost of power is in that state. You know, you think power costs the same everywhere. It doesn't. For instance, it costs a lot more in Hawaii, costs a lot more in California, costs more in Alaska. Its costs are very cheap in Washington State, which is primarily hydropower. Louisiana, most of MISO is somewhere in the middle. North Carolina, Texas are somewhere in the middle. If you have solar at the same marginal cost, it's going to be much more cost competitive in a state with high average prices, like Hawaii or Massachusetts, than in states with low average prices, like Washington, as an example. So the fact that you have net metering is incredibly important to how fast rooftop solar will penetrate. Standardized contracts are very important for how utility scale solar penetrates. Financing is very important for both rooftop and utility scale solar. Once you cut the costs of financing, and I think Beth knows this, it becomes much better, much easier to install solar and other distributed generation. So given that there are these fights in most states that have solar, a lot of states, as to whether or not to end net metering, what's going to make that decision? What's going to decide that? Well, one of the biggest questions, and one I think we'll all talk about a little bit, is what is the value of solar power and distributed generation? Right? You alluded to this in the avoided cost question, but it's a more fundamental question than that, because the state can maybe set its own policies, or maybe it's going to be preempted by PURPA. That's another issue we're not completely sure about. But should we give a credit for not producing carbon emissions, right? Because we don't have carbon priced into our system. Should we give a credit for resiliency, meaning how well will the grid hold up when disasters and storms happen? That's been a really big one. Distributed generation, like rooftop solar or neighborhood solar, may keep the lights on when everything else in a major grid goes off, right? How much is that worth? And that matters, because if a state calculates how much that's worth and those other values, mean something, well, that means that maybe coal, even at, 5 cents a kilowatt hour, maybe solar at 8 cents a kilowatt hour is really much more effective and cost effective for the state, because it also gives us these other values, right? The no carbon, resiliency, other kinds of things, certain kinds of control, distributed generation. So this is a major question that many states are grappling with. New York has probably gone the furthest in trying to analyze this. California has as well. What New York has come up with, as if you follow this at all, you may have heard, is definitely we give a preference to solar and a little bit wind, because they don't have a lot of wind there, because of resiliency and because of no carbon. But New York is also giving preference to nuclear for no carbon as well, right? And that's exactly right. It doesn't produce carbon emissions. It has other externalities, but it doesn't produce carbon emissions. So these states are trying to help reflect the true value and the true cost of sources of electricity. There's a conflict between whether or not the state can set that value and still sell power into the integrated system operators, and have that price reflected when it's launched into the system. So New York is in PJM, and so when it gives extra credit to nuclear or extra credit to solar, how does that get reflected in the price? So all of these things come together. How valuable is the power being produced, right? Are renewables then the best value because of their low carbon, et cetera? I would argue yes, especially the current cost structure. But then how does that integrate with these regional markets and dispatching lowest cost power? We don't fully know yet, right? What is FERC going to have to say if a state really, I'm not going to say messes with, but has an expansive definition of net metering, so that you can even, cash out credits at the end? California and Massachusetts are looking to do that. Is FERC going to say you can't? Does it conflict with PURPA? And FERC doesn't control retail sales, but it does control the wholesale market. Okay, so what do we need to look at? How much is this worth? How much is this pushing changes in the grid? And where are we going to be in the future? The good news is, going back to my home state of Texas, and the one good thing I can talk about with Texas, is that ERCOT has shown us that you can integrate renewables at a much higher level than the legacy utility companies were saying, right? You don't have to have a capacity market. You don't have to have as big a capacity market. Everybody squawks, oh, taking that coal offline, there won't be enough power this summer. But the regulators at ERCOT are like, yeah, there will. We're bringing on more megawatts of wind with integrated transmission. The word I'm looking for, the interruption or variability of solar and wind, right? They vary more than a baseload plant, has become much easier to manage. So from Texas, we learned it's not going to be that hard for our grids to get more renewable power on them. The biggest barriers are going to be, or helps, are going to be these state policies trying to figure out how valuable this kind of power is. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. That was a great evaluation of the critical issues. And certainly, speaking on behalf of a solar company here, residential solar company here in Louisiana, we do live or die by the net meter at this point. Louisiana is actually last in the nation, good 5-0, as of this year, in residential solar support or hostility. The only thing left in Louisiana that supports the growth of the industry is net metering, which in Louisiana we have the two regulatory regimes, one just for New Orleans that the New Orleans City Council regulates, which still protects net metering, so we have that full back and forth credit, which is how our company and several others actually took New Orleans to 6th in the nation in per capita in residential solar. We've since slipped a little bit, but supportive net metering is critical, at least for the next couple of years. And then unfortunately at the state level, the State Public Service Commission regulates and is largely has been captured by this rest of the state utilities. They've been attacking net metering for years, and we're just attacking it within the last couple months. And we were successful with some new Public Service Commission members in actually getting an independent study of, to just Victor's point, what are the costs and what are the benefits of net metering and solar for the grid in the state. So that actually just started a few weeks ago with, it sounds like a great, hopefully very independent person. We only have less than 1/4% solar penetration in the state of Louisiana. So it's not like Texas. We certainly don't have any valid complaints that it's causing problems for the grid. So in talking about fighting to save net metering in Louisiana and fighting for at least a few years, we were able to keep a great state tax credit that helped get a lot of residential solar installed in the state. We would not probably be where we are in net metering now with a small reason for hope. And I don't think we would have kept our incentive for as long as we did, since the utilities as well as the Koch brothers had a pretty aggressive effort for many years to eliminate the incentive earlier. In large part, we've done as well as we have thanks to the efforts of Thad Culley, who was here on the ground with us and with the Alliance for Affordable Energy for many years, just trying to support that. In fact, Thad still has a 504 area code. So, but his day job now is as regional director with Vote Solar. Before joining Vote Solar in that capacity in December of 2017, he was with the North Carolina-based law firm of Keys and Fox as a partner there, working on energy regulatory issues, customer scale, utility scale, distributed generation. He speaks net metering and interconnection dockets fluently, working in more than a dozen states to try and fight the good fight and support good solar policy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Speaking net metering sounds like just as nerdy as speaking Klingon, so thank you for that. And it's unmasked that we have this North Carolina nexus going on between us. So I guess it's no mistake that, you know, as mentioned, North Carolina is the second largest market for solar in the country right now, in no small part due to PURPA, which I just have to underscore the enormous importance of PURPA providing a floor. It's just the baseline. This gives access for renewable energy to get to the grid and to have a guaranteed buyer if there is no viable market. To the extent it's a floor for utility scale, it can also be a ceiling, as Victor alluded to, when it comes to customer scale. Because FERC has exclusive jurisdiction over wholesale sales, if a customer is interpreted or perceived to be engaged in a sale for resale to the utility, that is, the utility is going to turn around and sell it to another customer, that would be FERC jurisdictional, and states cannot set a wholesale rate that's in excess of avoided cost. So you have avoided cost being set in some states that have heavily on coal, like we're thinking, I think Utah, their avoided cost is in the 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour range, when their retail rate is in the 11 to 12 cent. So you can see that's not going to make a lot of economic sense for small scale solar, and maybe not even for large scale yet. Although the contracts that have been coming out in the West are surprisingly good, and I think the future is very bright. So that said, I want to pull out under the gimmick. Where's Forrest? I know I saw him come in here. Oh, there he is. Yeah, the cell phone gimmick. This is the disruptive technology, which is, if you got to see his excellent presentation yesterday, it's very true. Consumers drove this. This used to be a wires and poles, monopoly, a natural monopoly, and here came this disruptive force. The same thing's been said of solar. It's a disruptive force. It's upending the monopoly utility stranglehold on every kilowatt hour you purchase has to be from them. So now you have some options under PURPA, and this is another thing. I'll maybe point to a great article by John Wellinghoff, former chair of the FERC, wrote a great article about the kind of common law right to self-generation. Notwithstanding that, PURPA actually provides that same right. You have the right to have access to interconnect. You have the right to use your own power behind the meter before the utility. They don't even have to know what you're doing back there. And then you have the right to sell the excess. Now, as was said about net metering, what's great about that is it's not a sale. And maybe I shouldn't highlight just how precarious a position net metering as the primary driver of rooftop solar. It really rests on the interpretation of 5 members of FERC. I think it was in 2001, there was an interpretation of net metering that had been challenged by the utility, that you can't make us pay the retail rate for what comes to the grid. You have to charge at avoided cost for anything that goes to the grid. Well, FERC took a look at that and said, well, no, they're netting what they put to the grid and what they take from the grid over a monthly billing period. And that netting is accounting practice. It's not a sale. You're not taking money out of other customers' pockets and putting it into the net metering customers' pockets. It doesn't have all the legal fanciful structure as a sale of electricity would. So that interpretation is really just a creature of FERC. I don't know of any federal law or any federal court that has interpreted that. So if FERC were to change that, it would upend the dominant policy of over 40 states. So just to flag that, what happens to PURPA, what happens at FERC could have a serious impact on the ability of consumers to drive what happens in the clean energy revolution. And so I know we want to save plenty of time to talk, and I know I think they set the table extremely well, so I don't think there's a whole lot I can add to that, but I was just thinking about this in terms of this disruptive force that's clearly coming. You can see it coming a mile away, and utilities are about as agile as a freighter on the Mississippi. They cannot, so here comes, all they can do is yell iceberg ahead, and which is ironic because doing what they do, generating out of fossil fuels, there probably aren't going to be that many icebergs anyway, but here we are. So I will end there, and we can take it from here. And I guess, Beth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Okay. Boy, I had to grab that. I hadn't heard the phrase before, a common law right to self-generation. I love that. That's wonderful. All right, well, we wanted to open it up to questions. Clearly, this is a very complex, very quickly moving effort. The beauty of the law is with laws like that Carter-era PURPA is that this fight does play out in courts of law and regulatory bodies. But as many of you know, particularly if you've been in New Orleans for the last few days, it also very much plays out in the court of public opinion, especially in regulatory areas where you've got elected officials. These are very complex issues. Very seldom do you get an opportunity for the public to have meaningful participation, particularly when you have captured agency challenges. And yet, at its fundamental core, you have situations, particularly for low-income folks around the country, who are truly, truly struggling with the necessity of life, which is getting ever more challenging. And in New Orleans, a lot of you were in the natural gas session yesterday, but you should know that New Orleans has, by many measures, the second worst energy poverty in America, where you have a huge swath of families in the city, both homeowners and renters, who are paying more than 20% of their annual income on just their Entergy bill. That's not even adding in water bills or transportation costs. So these are critical issues, not just for businesses that are trying to grow and take advantage of what also by many measures is the fastest growing industrial revolution, clean energy revolution in the world, but that it is a very critical issue for each and every one of us, and at the most critical social justice level for low-income families, certainly in the U.S., but a worldwide challenge. So, how about some questions out there? Can I throw it out?
So, one question, so, the caveat that I know that, but what lessons have you been able to learn from SCI versus AT&T? Were you able to take a look
I would just say that the lesson learned is that deregulation can be painful, and there are going to be winners and losers, but that if it's done correctly, it ultimately does seem to increase choice, and usually put price pressure down. If you lived through that, you'd remember how disruptive it used to be, but now it's like, oh, it's great.
Now, I would just add to that, that it's not easy getting from a decades-old regulated regime to a full-blown deregulated customer choice regime. And there was this flurry of activity in the 90s, as I mentioned, 13 states deregulated, actually a bit more than that, some of them re-regulated because of problems that they had. And there's a lot that can go wrong. And that's why, what ultimately went wrong was Enron spun out of control, the California market crashed, and that was the end of that phase of deregulation. I think most observers think that, continue to think that the monopoly, vertically integrated monopoly control of electric generation is outmoded. It doesn't make any economic sense, and we've eventually got to make our way to an alternative. But there are a lot of devil in the detail, and in particular, one of the most challenging issues is that you will have a utility, a legacy utility, left with sunk costs, so-called stranded costs, that have to be provided for when you make this transition. And one interesting thing, encouraging thing that's going on in some markets around the country is that because of this huge pressure from large commercial industrial customers to get customer choice and the ability to control their electric futures, state commissions are allowing limited exit through the payment of exit fees. That's true in Washington State. Microsoft paid, I think, $27 million or something like that, and they now can buy electricity from whoever they want. The Las Vegas casino said, we're not doing this anymore. We're not only going to have be locked in this one source of electric supply. Again, they paid exit fees to cover their share of the sunk investment in the utility, and now they have to choice. So we're chipping away at the monopoly.
What a day. We heard that Texas is leading the nation in this transformation, and now we heard that big corporate is helping to lead the transition as well. So, it's a new day. So, yes.
So I have two unrelated questions. I hope that's okay. I think I can state them quickly. First, just what role is the sort of revolution that's taking place right now on storage technology is going to have on solar? It looks like we're on the cusp of maybe solid-state batteries. Already, even Elon Musk, of course, is providing these big storage facilities. And that seems like it could be a game changer in terms of renewables and especially solar. And the second unrelated question, but I think it's important here, has to do with municipalization of electricity. So I live in the city of Boulder, and Boulder's in this process of trying to go municipal. We are currently under the thumb of a legacy carrier, Xcel Energy. They've been trying desperately to block it at every step. It's been really a difficult struggle. But I'm wondering how municipalization of these kinds of sort of smaller scale kinds of utilities might relate to this larger discussion about trying to sort of bump up renewables.
I'll start with the second question briefly. So the three largest cities I think of that have municipal power, meaning they actually are a public entity selling, like we own these, we're selling to our residents, are Austin, San Antonio, and Seattle. And I will note that in Austin and San Antonio, that has made a huge difference in rooftop penetration because they have been able to control the policies to encourage it, to finance it, to assist lower income people doing it. So you see much more penetration there than you see in the just completely regulated markets in Houston and Dallas. I think they're coming, but the municipality really assisted them however, can take into account other values, right? It can take into account low-income folks, and poverty, it can do all those things.
I'm talking to San Antonio right now.
Yep, there you go. All right, so, yes. And in terms of the storage, I'll just note that I do think it's going to make a difference, but there was a very interesting study coming out of Texas. Yes, sorry.
folks are having a hard time.
Very interesting study coming out of Texas that showed that sometimes storage actually may increase carbon emissions because coal power plants might run more at night to store up. And the balancing that storage supposedly will help get to, the intermittency of wind and solar actually is being balanced much better by increased transmission. And in Texas, because there's consumer choice, we have an astounding impact of demand management. With these smart meters, they've been able to cut demand at the retail level, at homeowners, by 20%, the drop of a hat, just by saying, we'll give you money, just turn your power down. And that balance is working much more effectively than people could. So again, Texas as a laboratory is showing that, I think. But I do think it will make a difference.
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head. Game changer is absolutely what we're talking about. Solar plus storage is coming. It's here. And it's coming on a big scale, on a scalable pricing structure. I didn't say anything about the huge decline in the cost of solar in the last decade. Probably most of you know that. But the cost of solar installations have come down in the order of 85% over the last decade. The same thing is happening to storage. But beyond the price or economic considerations, as with everything we're talking about, there are huge regulatory drivers or potentially regulatory impediments that will determine the fate of solar plus storage. So I happen to have a couple of stats here. Well, first of all, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission just last month, I believe, issued a major new order in which it required all of these regional transmission organizations and independent system operators to review their rules and ensure that they did not have impediments that made it difficult for solar to bid into their wholesale auction.
Like storage?
Solar, what did I say?
You said solar?
Storage.
Yes.
Yeah, batteries. My apologies. But here are a couple of stats. There are 19 states today that require either integrated resource plans, that's something we haven't talked about yet, but this is where these regulatory commissions try to provide oversight over what these utilities are actually going to do and build. So now there are 19 states that require the storage has to be considered as part of the integrated resource plan. 4 states actually have affirmative storage procurements now, mandatory procurements. That's California, Massachusetts, Oregon, and New York. So we're going to see states just saying to utilities, you've got to do storage, just as they've said with renewable portfolio standards that you've got to do solar, wind, and the like. There's significant studies in my state of North Carolina and Nevada. 8 states are considering legislation on storage, and there are 3 active PSC, Public Service Commission, working groups now on storage. So there's a lot to figure out on this, but the key thing to think about is that with solar, you see a lot in the solar literature and all these regulatory debates about the so-called duck curve. And what that basically means is that the output profile of solar doesn't perfectly match the demand profile in most locations. Because if you think about it, when do we use the most power? When we get up in the morning and start using our appliances and turn up the hot water heater and so forth. So you have a peak in the morning and you have a peak in the evening when people come back home and start cooking dinner. Think about when solar optimally produces, it's the highest overhead right in the middle of the day. And so what solar plus storage is doing, gives us the ability to capture that generation, that energy produced in the middle of the day, and shift the delivery of it to certainly the evening peak and probably around that back in the morning. And when that happens, we have a total game change in both the economics and the practicality of energy delivery in this country, and it's coming very soon.
I'll speak briefly to both. Steve, would you mind going back to the list of factors? Which one? I forget which slide it was, but first I'll address the question you had about municipalization.
Employee cost factors?
Yes, perfect. There's a an effort underway in California and other places where they have what's called community choice aggregation. So it might not necessarily just be a municipal political authority that votes, but it'll give citizens a chance to vote to have a CCA formed. That CCA will go out and purchase power on behalf of those residents, and they can opt out and still receive service from the existing utility. Like in PG&E territory, there's Marin Clean Energy, so you can opt out. But you have a variety of packages. You can go 100% renewables, or you can go kind of a mix. It's about 85% renewables and a little bit of natural gas. So that's an interesting thing that's kind of taking over and represents a significant amount of the load. I think SDG&E estimated they could lose about 45% of their load to CCAs, which has caused the commission to kind of press pause and put a moratorium on any new CCAs being formed. I actually have a friend or two that one of my former colleagues is general counsel of one, and another person just started one. So they're actually, it's a pretty exciting development. And on storage, I would just add, we said it many times before, unlocking the value streams, and it's something that this FERC order will do. Typically, when you look at an avoided cost, you're talking about the energy and capacity value. When you get into the weeds and you're saying, well, here's a rooftop customer that is now going to put storage, they can now provide a lot of new benefits to the grid, which this order will, I think, help allow them to start stacking these values and to get something meaningful out of it. Another thing is we talked about the dumb meters and the dumb utility, which is slowly being replaced by smart meters and hopefully smarter utilities. There's the potential for automation that will really, I think, change the game in terms of how you can smooth out residential loads and reduce cost. And I mean, the magic bullet here, and this is something that sometimes consumer advocates take a stance against solar because they think, oh, you're going to raise costs on everyone. Well, there's a chance here to lower costs for everyone, harnessing private customer investment without relying on utility investment. So I think that's a really exciting thing. We're right on the cusp of.
It's awesome, and it'll make net metering just not a thing. Just 2 quick points on that. Speaking of smart utilities, Vermont's primary utility, Green Mountain Power, whose CEO is my personal hero, is offering a Tesla battery for $15 a month. So we are watching this very carefully, not just to eliminate the net metering problem, but for the resiliency issue. Everybody in every one of our customers would like battery backup, so when the grid goes down more than 7 times a day on average in New Orleans, they could shift over. Sorry, had to throw that out. They could shift over to their batteries, at least for a period of time. And one other thing, I may need your help on this. Was it the IRS or a FERC ruling, private letter ruling this week? The IRS issued a private letter ruling last Friday saying that batteries that were powered 100% by renewable could access the 30% income tax credit to help cut down the upfront cost. Now, it's just one letter in one situation, but for our purposes, all of our systems, we could make that showing, that a battery was charged 100% by a retrofitted project, as in it was a project where the batteries or panels were already up. They wanted to install batteries retroactively, and the IRS said, yep, you can get a 30% discount on that. So that is going to have huge impacts in partnership with the FERC decision on storage to, and obviously the costs are dropping even faster on storage than they did on solar. So this is about to become huge. So I didn't know who was next here, so I'm going to go with Ollie.
Well, so thank you very much for the questions on hand. I just have a recommendation. Get rid of this disruptive technology label on which we're going. That's an industry label. You need it just another slogan. You need another positive way of describing what we're about. Revolution doesn't work. And certainly disruptive. Who wants to disrupt? So, so go for it. And thanks so much. I have to do some things.
Thank you. All right.
Utility scale solar, the cost numbers seem to be showing it's very cost competitive. So, I guess the question is, does that mean that solar's going to start winning RFPs for utility bids? Well, the problem is, consistent with my description of the regulatory model, is that still in a great majority of states, there are no RFPs. So in the traditional vertically integrated monopoly regulated market, the utility just does whatever it wants. So for example, just last week, Florida Power and Light was able to persuade the Florida Public Service Commission to approve a huge new natural gas plant. And the Florida Power Plant Siting Act contains a provision that says you're going to build a power plant greater than 75 megawatts in the state of Florida, you have to go through a competitive process in order to demonstrate the need and that you're meeting the need in a least cost way. However, the law allows the commission to grant an exemption, a waiver from that requirement. Surprise, surprise, this captive regulatory body, and it's probably the most captive regulatory body in the country, state of Florida PSC, rubber stamp, gave them a waiver, and then ignored a very compelling case by the Sierra Club as to why this gas plant wasn't used in a complex legal proceeding. So the problem is, we don't get a shot at RFPs in many, many markets. The Arizona Public Service Company, an investor-owned utility, just had an RFP for 65 megawatts of peaking capacity, opened it up to all resources, and solar plus storage won that RFP. So we think we can win where we can compete. We certainly think renewables generally, sometimes depending on the geography, we may not be able to compete as effectively with wind in some of the big wind states, but we think we're at a point where renewables will compete effectively with conventional resources all day, every day. But we've got to have a shot. We've got to be able to get to the market.
Haven't we had some bids come in at under 2 cents for solar? Yeah, sorry, I didn't bring my notes with me. Yeah.
So I have a question regarding interconnection and zoning. So for example, what's the decline in traditional small-scale agriculture? Many landowners are wanting to get into solar. However, for example, in Oregon, there is this EFU zones of Muslim farm use that comes up. What do you think are some of the ways we can surpass that hurdle? And then when it comes to interconnection, how do you think we're going to deal with these long queue times and keeping the projects alive in order to wait projects for getting connection?
Well, are you working for a solar company? If not, send you about a job. Good, because you hit two key issues right on the head. Historically, in a lot of the country, the zoning land use issues for solar have not been a huge problem as the industry has grown. They've been a bigger issue for wind in a lot of places. But with the increasing penetration of solar, we're seeing the usual kind of NIMBY sorts of concerns, largely aesthetic, of people not wanting to see solar in certain places, and in particular in a number of states we see these ag preservation-based considerations about land use. So we're working actively to try to address and combat those. The one thing I would say about those is, take my state of North Carolina, which is the second largest utility scale solar state in the country. We have had 9,000 acres of agricultural land devoted to solar. That is less than 0.2% of the total ag lands in the state of North Carolina. That's over the last decade. In the same 10-year period, 1 million acres of ag land was converted to residential and commercial development. 100 times what's gone to solar. So when you hear people ranting against solar impact on agriculture, you can be sure they have some other motive than really protecting ag land, or they'd be going after other things. I had a little slide on interconnection, but just so everybody knows, we have to have an off-take agreement, PPA, available to sell our power as an essential part of the business. But the other thing we have to have is the ability to interconnect to the grid, so we can get our power onto the grid and then sell it. And unfortunately, in these vertically integrated regulated markets, the utilities also control the interconnection process. And we could be here all day talking about the games that they play with respect to interconnection, the delays, the technical obstacles that they throw up, the discriminatory treatment with respect to their own facilities. It's a huge issue. All I can say is that fighting it. We're fighting it all the time. I was 5 o'clock this morning looking at a long memo from a law firm about a new strategy for filing a case for over the interconnection problem. So it's a big issue. I live it every day. I don't have a great solution, but I mean, I think what we see, to be honest and not inflammatory, is that the utilities are clinging to a dying business model. It doesn't make sense in today's environment, and they are using every technique and every tool at their disposal to try to hold on to these captive monopoly profits and the current regime for as long as they can. And certainly interconnection is a really powerful tool that they have. So.
I just want to say one more word about that. It kind of relates to North Carolina. It gets back to the value system. So what the legacy companies have started to claim is they should be in charge of the queue, like which ones come first, because electricity has different values depending on where it comes into the grid, like what load it's serving, what time of day it's serving, all of those things. And that is true, right? It is true. But what I think we should be looking at is if you're going to do that, right? If you're getting into the value of solar, let the PUC or an independent body decide where the queue is. Give that signal to the solar companies so they can know where they want to bid in. Don't let the legacy carrier be the one to decide that. That's just my view. So, and I know we were looking at that in North Carolina at some point.
Well, I want to be inflammatory because I'm not licensed to practice law right now. So to Ollie's point, if the legacy utilities are fighting energy independence, you want to call it that, energy freedom, it is painfully ironic that they're trying to use something that was intended to protect farmers. That is clearly a non-issue, much like you frequently hear comments about when the solar panels when their life is over and the batteries are just going to go in a dump, by the same industries that never want to talk about any of the externalities of the traditional fossil fuel industry. So good questions and good points. All right, I'm not sure who's had their hand up the longest. I'll take Forrest and then you.
Project costs and ultimately prices for customers, and utility incentives in terms of their own interest, their ability to earn a profit on a project, and different tax treatments related to incentives. So basically what I'm kind of getting at the heart of it is, can you talk about what are some of the factors that would differentiate the cost of PPA projects from the cost of utility-owned solar projects, like how those play out in terms of either higher or lower cost for customers?
Just one brief response then, if I'm understanding your question. I mean, legacy companies make money on capital investments, right? Because they can lock in a rate of return on that by the PUC. So the more capital investment they have, the more money they can make. So that model is being disrupted left and right, and would be disrupted even without wind and solar, because efficiency gains are dropping the electricity demand. So in terms of their solar and building solar, presumably they would also try to recapture that, and their reasoning would be, we're retiring coal, we're taking that off the grid, that causes them to pay down, so now bake in the cost, the capital structure cost of that.
Yeah, I would just add to that, as we try to move towards an all-resource competitive procurement process. So that's one way to inject competition we were talking about a little while ago. It becomes necessary to get an apples-to-apples comparison. So if you imagine, and we're going through this right now, the competitive process in North Carolina. So parties are going to be able to bid in for 600 megawatts of generation. That can be in the form of a third-party power purchase agreement, our typical way of doing business. It can be in the form of a sale of an asset to the utility, so the utility will now be buying it and become the owner, so that's just the way it might buy a plant, or the utility can self-develop and build the plant. And those are going to be scored competitively by a third party, independent third party, in a solicitation process. So you've got to have some way to convert those all into the same metric. sometimes referred to as the least cost of energy. And we haven't really figured out exactly what that's going to work, but that's got to happen in order to overcome the concern that you have, because if you're trying to compare these things, pricing them in a different way, you're not going to be able to make a meaningful comparison. But beyond the sort of methodology, just a couple of things why we think we're the better option is, and certainly with respect to cost of service rate making, some of this was touched on before about risk. That's one consideration, is that anytime we do something, we're contracting to sell at a price. If it winds up costing us more than we thought to build or finance our project, that risk is all on us. The customer still pays us the same thing. The cost of service rate making, the utilities have to really screw up badly for a commission to say that wasn't a prudent investment. So they routinely get cost overruns, high cost approved as prudent investments. In addition, it's just the case, and when you talked about the giant ship that you're trying to turn when the iceberg is coming, these big utilities just can't build these distributed or semi-distributed smaller scale solar and wind and other renewable assets as cheaply as independent power producers. But this is our core business. We know how to do it. We've been doing it for years. We have the relationships across the supply chain with the landowners. We have the EPC contracting functions ourselves that the utilities don't have. They just can't do it as cheaply as we can. And a good example of that, I mentioned Florida earlier. Both Florida Power and Light and Duke in Florida have come in recently. They all want to build solar now. They just want to build it themselves and put it in their rate base so they can charge whatever they want and get a rate of return on it. So they've both come in and gotten approval, one at $1.75 a watt, I think somewhere between $1.65 and $1.75 a watt, and they can recover costs plus a 10 or 11% rate of return on top of that. And the commission said, sure, go right ahead and build 700 megawatts of that, without asking the question, well, what could Cypress Creek or these other companies build it for? And the number is a lot lower, 25, 30, maybe even 40% lower than the number that the commission's approved the investor-owned utilities to build. So we're fighting on that, but on all of this stuff, and we shouldn't underestimate this. This is all politics. We're fighting in legislatures, we're fighting in Congress every day, trying to build the political wherewithal to compete with these companies who literally have been the 800-pound gorillas in the political process for 100 years. So that's what we're up against, but we are fighting a good fight.
You can't fight the future. Are we up on time?
Yeah.
Okay, we're officially out of time, but I know everyone here would be happy to answer further questions. So stick around if you want. And thank you, gentlemen.